All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's lesson. In today's lesson, we'll be going over. Actually, no. Before we start today, we're gonna have a little different kind of class. Obviously, you're gonna be watching a recorded video of me. Um, Obviously, there are some downsides to it. One of which is you won't be able to ask questions live. However, you will be able to if you guys have any questions after the video, again, you can feel free to email me or we can always go over it during class. Sorry about the inconvenience. I'm going to be busy at 7 tomorrow. But yeah, let's get right into it. So today, writing language, um, not assessment, sorry. Section 2. Well, it's going to be more grammar intensive, more material intensive, where we're going to start learning new topics, new ideas. They might be common sense because you guys have already probably gone over the fundamental basis of the English language, like dependent, independent clauses, what is entailed in them, and then some extra things as well, right? So just to get started, we're going to be talking about a sentence, right? So sentence, and then we also have a fragment. A sentence, also known as an independent clause, as the name suggests, can stand by itself, meaning that you can have it so it's its own individual sentence. It has a subject and a verb that complement each other, right? So the verb complements the subject and it makes complete sense. It demonstrates a whole thought. That is what makes a sentence a subject and a complementing verb, and that kind of demonstrates a complete thought, right? So that are the three criteria to make a sentence, right? Or an independent clause and independent clause. A subject, right? It could be a noun, a verb, or or it could be a pronoun of some sort. Verb obviously is an action, and then they have to complement one another. Complement. Actually, no, not necessarily complement. Just make sure it's cohesive and it demonstrates a whole thought. Complete thought. And you guys are probably questioning, so what qualifies as a complete thought? Right. So what qualifies as a complete thought? So before we get to that, what's a fragment? Fragments could be dependent clauses, non-essential clauses, something that cannot stand by itself. Needs to be linked to a dependent clause. Or to an independent clause or another dependent clause to make sense, right? So that's what I mean. It can have a subject and verb, but it cannot demonstrate a complete thought, right? It can have a subject and verb. It doesn't have to, right? But it does not demonstrate a complete thought as our sentence counterpart does. So let me give an example. Louis Armstrong was one of the greatest jazz musicians of the 20th century. So is that a sentence or a fragment? Okay, let's write this down. We have Louis Armstrong was one of the greatest jazz musicians of the 20th century. Is that a sentence? Yes, it is. Right? We have our subject, a name, a noun, was one of the greatest jazz musicians of all time, right? Was one of the greatest jazz musicians of all time. It's a sentence. It demonstrates a complete thought and it also has a verb. Let's just look at this one. Who was one of the greatest jazz musicians of all time? So you're going to be saying that looks like a sentence, right? We have our quote unquote subject here, who is not a subject, right? Don't get that confused. When it says who are we referring to? We don't know who, right? It's a very indirect pronoun, right? It doesn't direct itself to anything. Nothing was stated before. It's not a pronoun like it or which or whatever, right? It's who, right? Who's who, right? We don't know who. That sounds very confusing. But who, this is a fragment because we don't know who is, right? It can't be a standalone thing because it doesn't serve as a subject here. So we have a verb and I guess we have a complete thought, but who is not a subject, right? Who is not a subject? Because remember, a fragment can have a subject and a verb. It doesn't have to. But if it doesn't have a subject, verb, and complete thought, if it doesn't have all these three criteria, it is not classified as a sentence. And for that reason, two cannot be a subject or a sentence. Let's try this one. He is, however, considered one of the greatest. Sorry, this is going to be of here. Of the greatest jazz musicians of the 20th century. Sorry, excuse my handwriting. But is this a sentence or a fragment? It is a sentence, right? We have our he, we have our noun, we have our subject, and is its infinitive is to be, right? Is, was, to be. That's what it means, right? So remember, we have he, we have is. So we have our verb and we have our noun and we or our subject, and we have a complete thought. He is considered one of the greatest jazz musicians of the 20th century. Complete thought, right? We have again subject, verb, and complete thought. Therefore, it is a sentence. So let me write SFS just to get a general understanding of what exactly we're looking at here. Let's look at another one. Okay. This one's gonna trick you guys up. Number 4. Although he was one of the most successful trumpet players of his generation. Period. Is this a sentence? Okay, let's go over what we have. We have our subject, right? Our subject here is going to be he. And we have our complementing verb, was, or to be. Infinitive is to be, right? Past tense of is. But does it demonstrate a complete thought? Let's check. Although he was one of the most successful trumpet players of his generation. No, it doesn't. So it says despite this, and it doesn't go on to tell us the other side of the scenario. If you have an although, if you have or despite this blah, you need to have the other blah, right? Defining what the other thing is. Like for example, although he was one of the most successful trumpet players of his generation, he was not the best of all time. Then that would be complete thought, right? Because look, we have our independent clause right here. He was not the best of all time. He, our subject, we or was our verb, not the greatest of all time or not the best of all time. That demonstrates a complete thought, right? So remember, and I'll go into how you link dependent and independent clause together. But see, the beginning is a dependent clause because again, it does not generate a complete thought. However, when it's linked to a complete thought or an independent clause, it can be concluded as a sentence. But in this case, since it's only this part right here, although he was one of the most successful trumpet players of his generation, it is not a complete thought because it just introduces a kind of qualification or yeah, I guess you can phrase it as qualification, but it doesn't go on to describe the other aspect of that, if that makes sense, right? We have although, right? But it doesn't go on to explain the other side of that, right? So now that we have like a general understanding of what we're messing with, let us go to the juicy stuff. Right? So we have building a sentence. So again, like I said, in order to build a sentence, you must have a subject and this is the fragment section. Remember, we must have a subject and a verb in order for the sentence, or in order to create a sentence, and it must also demonstrate a complete thought. Right. So make sure you guys have this ingrained. So why am I telling you this right now? Multitude of reasons. Right now, right? If you want, the SAT is going to be asking you, or they're going to be asking you, should you put a comma or should you put a semicolon, et cetera, et cetera. You're going to need to know what side, if the left side of the comma or the left side of the semicolon is a independent clause or if it's a dependent clause. And if it is a dependent clause, is a statement after that, is that independent or dependent, right? Because you have to use different punctuation based on, or you have to use different punctuation based on the type of sentences or based on the type of statements they give you, right? I'll go into that afterwards. So we go over the simple sentence, right? The simple sentence is the subject, the verb, and complete thought. So to give you an example, it will look like the tomato grows. So we have the tomato, our subject, and then we have our verb. And then this talks about a complete thought. Perfect, right? Perfect example here. Right? That's perfect. Now let's go on to the prepositional phrases. So what prepositional phrases are, you don't really need to know this, but it's always good to have a general idea. So when you're like maneuvering through the questions, you can define different phrases and what they actually mean. So let's look at the prepositional phrases here. So we have prepositional phrases. What are they? So prepositional phrases can be likened to dependent clauses or non-essential clauses that are not needed or can be taken out to make and the sentence will still make sense. So prepositional phrases can be talking about like the time or the place in which the event or the sentence is going on. So what I mean by that, it can be located at the beginning of a sentence, or it could be located at the end. It could be located in the middle. So what I mean by that, let me show you what I mean. So let's say okay, so our prepositional phrase here, I'm going to be using is in the treehouse. So we're going to be using this as the example, in the treehouse. So what I mean by this is a non-essential dependent, meaning non-essential as the name implies, meaning is that it's not essential or it is not needed for the sentence to make sense. Let's put this into action so I can show you what I mean. In the greenhouse, the tomato grows. Right? So we have our dependent clause in the greenhouse, or a prepositional phrase. The tomato grows. Perfect. We have our dependent, and then we have our independent right here. Perfect. You can link a dependent and independent clause together through a comma, right? So you can either start with an independent clause, and then you can use a comma that separates the independent and dependent clause, or you can start with the dependent, and then you can comma independent. Simple as that, right? Nothing else needed. But yeah, right. However, if you do start with a dependent clause, you do want to, if you do start with a dependent clause, the first word that comes or starts in the independent clause, right? As you can see here. So we start with the dependent clause. We start the sentence with the dependent clause. However, the first word that comes after the independent clause, or the first word that begins the independent clause, has to be a subject, or the sentence is grammatically incorrect. So as you can see here, the dependent clause, right? But the first word in the independent clause is the tomato, right? Or the obviously provides a title for the tomato. But the tomato is our subject here, right? That is the first word in the independent clause, and therefore it is grammatically correct. Remember, if you start with the dependent clause, the first word that comes after that comma, granted that the beginning isn't, the next statement is an independent clause, must be a subject, or it's incorrect. Right? Just remember that. So remember, if we have dependent, comma, subject, and then we have this whole thing will be independent, right? Just make sure the independent clause starts with a subject. Remember that. All right. So I just need to get that ingrained in your head, because that took me a freaking while to understand as well. Pronouns. What are pronouns? Pronouns are basically smaller versions of the actual thing that refer back to the subject. Pronouns could be looking, or it could be looked upon as. So what? Let's give you some pronouns. So pronouns could be it, they, nothing, everything, anything along those lines. As long as it refers back to the subject, as long as it refers back to the subject, this sentence can still make sense. So I'm going to ask you, it grows. Is that a sentence? Yes, it is. For these two reasons. It refers, or it is our subject here. It refers to the tomatoes, right? Grows is our verb. It grows, complete thought. It's a sentence. Simple as that, right? Grow is our verb, just along those lines. Now let us move on to what else we have. So we have groups, right? You can group things, right? So we can have pronouns in the grouping of words. So what I mean by that, so let's have pronoun in grouping. So tell me if this is a sentence. Many are grown in greenhouses around the world. It is a sentence, right? Many, right? Many is our subject here. Are is a plural version of to be, are grown in greenhouses around the world. Perfect, right? Because we have our subject, right? Many what? Many tomatoes are grown around the world, right? Right. When you see the word many, you can think of it like this. Not in all scenarios, right? But in this scenario, you can have it so many, and then think about it of them, of what? Of the tomatoes, right? Of them are grown in greenhouses around the world. Perfect, right? Because remember, you can only use the word many if it was previously stated of a singular subject, not a singular subject, like of only one subject. If one subject was provided previously, then you could use many. But if two subjects were provided previously, you need to define it, right? So what I mean by that is, like, let's say I say tomato and broccoli. If I talked about those in the previous sentence, right, then I would have to go on and define many many. I don't even know the plural form of broccoli. Let's use bananas instead. Right. So let's say tomato and banana. Let's say I talk about those in the previous sentence. Many, and then I have to define which one am I talking about here. Because if I'm talking about two, I must define it. Because on the writing section, you're going to be given stuff like this, right? They're going to be giving you, or in the previous sentence, they're going to be saying, they're going to be talking about two subjects. Like they can, in this case, they can be talking about tomatoes and bananas. And then in the next sentence, they're going to be underlying the specific portion, or a noun, a pronoun, and it's going to be asking, which one should you say? It, they, banana, or no change. You're gonna have to pick banana, because if you use it, they, it doesn't specify which subject you're talking about specifically here. You have to use the specific one. So you have to literally kind of refer back to which one you are explicitly stating. Because when you introduce two topics, you must explicitly state which topic you want to be talking about in the next sentence. That is, if you're given, if two or more subjects are provided. If only one subject was talking about in the previous sentence or in the previous thought, then you can use it or they. If that is not the case, if there are two or more subjects, you must refer to it like I did here. So many bananas or many tomatoes. But if only tomatoes we're talking about, I can use many of them, or many are grown across the world, right? But remember, if there are two or more, so let me write this down. If two or more subjects, you must clarify in the next sentence. Two or more, you must clarify. Never forget that. However, if it is only one, you can use a pronoun. Okay? Let me. All right. Pronoun, it, they, etc., etc. All right, great. We have that out the way. All right. Let's move on to some more important things. Non-essential clauses. So non-essential clauses, what I was discussing about earlier, we might need a new page here. All right. So let's talk about non-essential clauses, and then we'll call it a day right now. So we got non-essential clauses. What are non-essential clauses? Non-essential clauses are, or is, information that can be placed in a sentence, right? It can be placed anywhere in the sentence. Because remember, non-essential clauses, you can take them out. They're typically separated in the sentence with commas. That means you can take them out and the sentence will still make sense. So let me craft one for you. Aryan Shelky, a tutor at FYPY or FYBY. By the way, that's the new organization name. Aryan Shelky, a tutor at FYBI or BY, is going to NC State University. That's not true yet. I haven't committed anywhere. In fact, I haven't gotten to NC State just yet. But back to this. Aryan Shelky, a tutor at FYBI, is going to state. So what here's our non-essential clause? It's right here. A tutor at FYBY. That's extra information. Again, we can take this out. So what I mean by literally, you can literally take this out and the sentence will still make sense. Aryan Shelky is going to state. Perfect. Aryan Shelky, the subject, is to be going to state. Perfect. That perfectly emphasizes or fits all the parameters set by the grammatical syntax, right? It perfectly does that. And that too, you'll learn that these non-essential clauses or these dependent clauses are separated by commas. What I mean by that is that if you see something in a sentence and if it's separated by comma, and if in the separation of the commas, like in between the commas, you see information, cross it out. And if you can cross it out, and if you can read the sentence without the crossed out portion, and if it makes sense, that area is a non-essential clause. Anything with information can be deduced with these commas, right? And then you can put the information between the commas and the sentence will still make sense. Let me give you another one. The tomato, a popular salad, condiment. I don't really know. I'm not a chef. The tomato, popular salad condiment, is a nutritional fruit because apparently tomatoes are fruits. I don't understand that either. So the tomato, okay, we got our subject. A popular salad condiment. Extra piece of information that is not needed for the sentence to become a sentence or a sentence to remain a sentence, right? So we can take this out, right? Because remember, it's separated by commas here. Is a nutritional fruit. The tomato is a nutritional fruit. Perfect, right? We got it down. All right. Hey, guys. Hopefully you guys are doing well. We're going to go over a quick 5-minute segment over linking clauses together. The transition type of kind of grammatical syntax, what do you call it? Breaks, I guess. The M dash. Actually, for right now, we're going to be going over the period, the semicolon, the colon, and we'll be going into M dash and parentheses later on because they both are kind of used in the same context or same sense, right? So let us go about this. So let's first talk about what if we wanted to link two independent clauses together, right? Typically, you're going to see this a lot if you want to link two independent clauses together, right? They both are full sentences. But what kind of punctuation would you use to link those two together, right? So let's say we have an independent and an independent. There are two ways you can go about this. You can add a period, right? The simple period, we all should know what a period is, right? Separates the two sentences. Or you can use a semicolon, right? So why would you pick one over the other? Okay, so you would use a period if the subjects talked about in the two independent clauses are different. I mean, not necessarily different, but if they're not really related to one another, right? Because if one independent clause talks about Louis Armstrong and another talks about like another famous or successful person in the 20th century, you don't want to be connecting those two independent clauses via semicolon, right? Those are two different thoughts. I mean, of course, they're two different thoughts. They're two different ideas, so you don't really want to correlate them, right? That's why you use a period because it kind of sets off a that those two subjects are not related, right? So you would use a period here. However, you would use a semicolon, right? When you would use a semicolon is used when the two independent clauses are related to one another, related idea wise, right? So let's say I'm talking about me, right? Aryan Shelky is I don't know. Aryan Shelky is 17 years old, and then you could have a semicolon, and then you can say he goes to Panther Creek High, right? You could do that. They're mildly related, right? But you don't want to say Aryan Shelky or Aryan Shelky 17 years old and Barack Obama was the president of the United States. Those are completely different ideas here, right? So you would use a period when we relate like Aryan Shelky and Barack Obama because obviously we're unrelated. But you use a semicolon if you like talk about the same subject or it's mildly related to the main idea of that paragraph or that idea in the sentence previously, right? So remember, you can only use a semicolon or you can only use a period if both sides of the statements are independent clauses. If it's not an independent clause on both sides, you can't use it. Okay? So let's go to the colon. What about this thing? When do we use a colon? Because I know a lot of people get tricked up on the utilization of a colon. So a colon has three main uses and it can only be used in the following scenario. So you can use a colon if the first statement is an independent clause, and then you can put independent colon dependent clause, right? You can do this. In rare occurrences, you can do an independent and an independent. But that's a very rare occurrence. Really, make sure you have this one in mind, okay? The independent clause together or matched with a colon. So there are three reasons why you would use a colon. First reason, to explain something. So To explain, when you're using to explain, right? You're probably going to be messing with an independent clause, right? So let's say Ari and Shelky did good on calculus, and then he got a 95 in the class, right? So you can use a colon here, right? Because remember, it explains why I did good in class. I got a 95. So that's an example of an explanation. The second use would be to define something. So over here, it says, but Jason Box, an associate professor of geology at Ohio State, believes that another factor added to the early thaw, right? So this is an instance in which it provides an example, the thaw, right? So it says believes that another factor added to the other early thaw, and then you would use a colon here, and then the colon is used to define what the other factor was. So that is an example in which you can use to um, use a colon, obviously, if you're trying to define a certain thing that is presented in the previous or in the independent clause. The last use would be if you're trying to list something, right? If you're trying to list, let's say, the restaurant provided many utensils, colon, forks, knives, spoons, or spoons, no, sporks, just things along those lines, right? So you would use it to list. So for example, an example I would thought just out of thin air was the restaurant provided many utensils, colon, because then you go on to talk about what the many utensils that it provides, and then you list them, right? So we got forks, knives, spoons, and then sporks. I don't really know if sporks is a real thing, but again, along those lines, you'd be using that, right? And then that's basically it. That's all I have for you guys as of right now. So what I want you guys to do is go and take the SAT test 1 and then passage 3 of the what do you call it, of the SAT test, right? So to make sure to take the passage 3. The passage 3 is going to be narrative about this guy working in or guy finding an office area. I believe that's what it was. Let's go and check. So it is co-working creative solution. That's the one. And I will provide a link for that in the Google Classroom. But make sure to utilize what I taught you today, and make sure you guys understand the inner mechanisms of these sentences, right? Make sure you know how they are stated, why they are stated as they are, right? See, understand, like right here, they use the colon. Why did they use a colon? Things of that sort.